really to make a case for atheism. I am an atheist, I'm afraid. Any atheists in this room other than me? Be interested to see. Oh, a few. Yeah. Good. So, making a case for atheism. Well, let me begin by setting out the kind of God, in particular, that I certainly don't believe in. The kind of God I'm going to focus on is the God of classical monotheism, the kind of God that Jews and Christians and Muslims all believe in, a God that is supposed to be something like a person, someone who is all-powerful, supremely powerful, all-knowing, omniscient, and supremely good or benevolent. God has at least these three characteristics. And it seems to me that it's very unlikely that there's anything like that outside of the universe, or anything like that that is the creator of the universe. I'm happy to admit that I don't know the answer to the question, why is there anything at all? But I can be pretty confident that certain answers are incorrect, and I'm pretty damn confident that this particular being is not responsible, is not the explanation. So let me set out my reasons, some of my reasons. I can only do it very briefly. There's no doubt that human beings are drawn to the idea that there's agency operating in the world. By agency, I mean something like a person, a being with beliefs and desires on which they might more or less rationally act. We are agents, and we attribute a certain amount of agency to other species, to monkeys and cats and dogs and so on, and occasionally to machines. But for the most part, we suppose that the natural world is free of agents until we hit a mystery, when suddenly it becomes very tempting to suppose that there must be some agent back there after all. So, for example, when we couldn't explain the movements of the heavenly bodies, the rather peculiar motions that they make, we suppose that there must be beings up there, agents of some sort, gods that move them around, and that's the explanation for their otherwise inexplicable behaviour. When we were baffled by the way in which living things grow, we didn't know the naturalistic explanation. We supposed that there must be invisible beings of some sort operating behind the scenes, sprites or fairies or something like that, pushing the plants up and causing them to grow. And when we couldn't explain natural disasters and terrible illnesses and so on, and we didn't know the naturalistic explanation, we supposed that there must be demons or witches operating behind the scenes, and it was their activities and their malevolent desires that were the explanation for what we saw going on. Now, of course, as things have progressed, as science has progressed, we've come to understand more and more about how the world works. And we know that we don't need witches and demons and fairies and sprites and gods in the sky to move the planets around anymore. All of those things have perfectly good naturalistic explanations. But still, the temptation is always very strong. We're increasingly understanding why the temptation is so psychologically strong in human beings now. We can talk about that maybe a bit later on. But there is this very strong temptation when we're faced with a question we don't know the answer to suppose that there's somebody back there that did it. Some kind of invisible person is responsible. And of course, there are always going to be questions we can't answer, and perhaps the question, why is there anything at all, is such a question. And of course, it's then immediately very tempting. The first thing we turn to, the first thought that pops into our head when we ask ourselves that question and we can't figure out what the answer could possibly be, we think, somebody did it. There's a person back there that's responsible. Well, now maybe there is. I rather doubt it. But maybe there's a person back there that created the universe. What I'm going to suggest is that even if we know that the universe has a cause, which I rather doubt, even if we know that the cause is some sort of necessary being, which I rather doubt, even if we suppose that this cause is something like a person, which frankly, I'm not sure I can even make sense of that suggestion, a person outside of time and space, but hey, let's go with that. I think we nevertheless have overwhelming empirical evidence that that person, if it's there at all, is not the traditional god of monotheism. I think we can establish that pretty conclusively just by looking around us. So how might we do that? Well, you might do this. You'd have heard this a million times before, but hopefully I'll give it a new twist for you. We might look at the amount of pain and suffering that there is in the universe, and the amount of moral evil that there is. I'm sure very many of you have thought about the problem of evil, and there are, of course, many explanations which theists have developed which they think can deal with the problem. And I'm going to approach the problem in such a way that I hope it will raise some questions in your mind about whether these explanations are actually really adequate. So, here we go. Not very long ago, I watched a program. How are we doing for time, by the way? Am I okay? How long have I got? I want to pace myself, sorry.
17 minutes.
Oh, nice. Right, okay. So, who watched David Attenborough's program Life recently? Any of you watched that? Yeah. Did you watch the one involving Komodo dragons? Any of you? Do you remember that one? That was absolutely horrific. It was just the most depressing program. What they did was they went to this island where these big lizard-like creatures wander around, and they filmed a Komodo dragon bite a water buffalo on the ankle. And the water buffalo just kind of shrugged it off and walked away. But what we don't realise at the time is that what the Komodo dragon has done is it's poisoned the water buffalo. And it's going to take about 2 weeks for the water buffalo to die. So the water buffalo gradually starts to get weaker and weaker. And then other Komodo dragons begin to appear and follow the water buffalo around. And they start nipping at it. It becomes weaker still. After the most appalling suffering, the thing finally gets eaten alive by the Komodo dragons. When the photographer, this was his first assignment for one of his photographers, when he was asked about what it was like to film this afterwards, he said that he was probably going to have to give up wildlife photography because it was just so utterly appalling. Nature is beautiful, but nature is unbelievably cruel beyond your imagination. This was just one creature suffering the most appalling way over a 2-week period. This kind of thing has been going on for hundreds of millions of years on a global scale before we even showed up. This is a horrifically cruel world. There's plenty of nice stuff in it, but do not underestimate just how horrific and unpleasant this world is for very many of the sentient inhabitants now and that have existed over hundreds of millions of years, including our predecessors. So that looks to me like pretty good evidence that if the universe is the creation of some sort of superperson, assuming that even makes any kind of sense, some sort of superperson, then this superperson is, well, either not all-powerful, because they surely could have produced less suffering, or they're not all-knowing because they don't know about the suffering, or they're not supremely benevolent, because no supremely benevolent being would do that. They might put some suffering in the world for the sake of certain greater goods. What I'm focusing on is the quantity. And of course there's human suffering too. You don't need me to remind you about it. There are children buried alive in earthquakes. There are people dying in the most horrific way from diseases and natural disasters and so on. It's shocking. It's staggering how much cruelty and suffering this world contains.